Growing Together, a gardening podcast, is sponsored by Bloomfield Garden Center, a family-owned retail greenhouse providing locally grown plants since 1974. You can find them 1 mile north of Sabin, Minnesota, or 6 miles south of I-94 at Exit 6. Just a quick drive from Fargo-Moorhead.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to Growing Together, a gardening podcast with me, John Lamb, and Don Kinzler, a lifelong gardener and the North Dakota State University Extension horticulturist for Cass County. Don, how you doing?
I'm doing great. I'm enjoying our vegetable garden, our flower garden, and wonderful time of year.
It's a great time. July is kind of a great time, isn't it?
It is. It is so much fun to see the flowers that you planted in spring, see them develop and bloom. And the vegetable garden, it's amazing the amount of growth that things get from the time you put those seeds in the ground in May until now. It's really kind of amazing, isn't it, how much growth we get in just a couple of months?
Yeah. Well, before we get too far, we want to let you know that this podcast is sponsored by Bloomfield Garden Center, a family-owned retail greenhouse providing locally grown plants since 1974. And you can find them 1 mile north of Sabin, Minnesota, or 6 miles south of I-94 off Exit 6. Just a quick drive from Fargo-Moorhead. Hey, Don, what's a tomato's favorite kind of dance?
I don't know.
Salsa.
Well, yeah, I assume until they find themselves in the salsa.
Right.
I like it.
Well, we wanted to talk about tomatoes, not necessarily salsa as America's number one condiment, but we wanted to talk about tomatoes because tomatoes really are.
Is that America's number one condiment?
I think
That's
so.
Interesting. I bet you're right.
I think it beat out ketchup.
Oh, wow. Awesome. Both driving from tomatoes.
Exactly. But we wanted to talk about tomatoes because that really is it's probably safe to say I didn't find any research that says for sure, but if it's not the number one crop for home gardeners, it's got to be the top two.
It is the number one. Yeah. For quite a few years, I'm not sure how far back it goes, but it is America's number one homegrown vegetable. And when you think about it, even people with apartments or condos oftentimes have a tomato plant.
Yeah.
And so it can be, no matter where you're at, you can really have a tomato plant as long as you've got a sunny spot.
Yeah. So we wanted to talk about that because we are in July. Tomatoes the plants are doing well. Maybe there's even signs of some fruit. The flowers are coming along. So we want to talk about some things that you should be doing with your tomato plants, some things to keep an eye on. And just kind of this, it's fun because this is one of the first real, we're going to see tomatoes coming in real soon. And we're excited about it. We want to get everybody excited about it. How many different kinds of tomatoes are you growing this year?
I am growing, I'm growing 4 different types. In the past I've grown more. I have a total of 48 plants. In the past, I've grown more different varieties, but I have
48 tomato plants?
48 tomato plants.
Okay.
Yep. And this year I narrowed it down to 4 types because they've just been historically my favorites. And so this year I'm not trying as many. But Celebrity is always a good one for me. Big Beef, which is a nice size, but it ripens in mid-season. So it's not a late one, but good size, good flavor. And Mountain Pride, it's a little earlier one, the Mountain series I really like. And then the other one is Sun Sugar Cherry Tomato.
And that one, I have to give you all the credit. That's one that you turned me on to years ago. You came through here at the Forum office with a little flat.
Oh, you remember, yeah.
That was such an indelible moment because you were offering this like, oh, would you like to try this? And you weren't selling them. You had a bunch because that's the other thing. People who grow tomatoes, if you've got 48 plants, you're going to have more than you can probably use.
Exactly.
So that's the great thing about tomatoes. It allows us to be a community and to share with other people. But yeah, you brought in some sun sugars, and from that moment on, I was like, oh, I've got to grow these.
And the way I found sun sugar, I was touring the University of Minnesota Landscape Arboretum one summer a number of years ago. And as you went into their building, their visitor center, they had a table set up with a taste test, a blind taste test. You didn't know what what the varieties were, but they had all these different cherry tomatoes, and there are so many different cherry tomatoes. They had all these different cherry tomatoes, so you went along and tasted all these, and wow, this one, and then you voted. And the one there that I sampled, wow, that was the best. And then you turned over the cart and sun sugar. And so I've grown it ever since. And you really only need one plant of sun sugar because it's very, very productive. So I have 48 tomato plants. I have 47 other varieties and one sun sugar.
Speaking of, well, we're going to talk a lot about different kinds of tomatoes, but now that you bring it up, what is the difference between a cherry tomato and a grape tomato?
Basically the shape.
Okay.
Yep, the grape tomatoes will have just the kind of an elongated, grape type. So yeah, there's not a hard and fast rule, but basically the cherry tomatoes are a class that are rounded. Grape tomatoes will have a little more of an oblong shape.
They do
but
not
very
have
similar.
a pit. The cherry tomatoes do not have a pit.
No.
Yes.
No, exactly.
So let's just kind of jump into some questions here. And one of them is that we're talking about tomatoes. Here it is in July. Is it too late to go out and buy a tomato plant and get started?
Yeah, because if we're talking about tomatoes and somebody's listening and thought, gosh, that'd be fun. Can I still have a tomato? If you chose a variety that has a really short ripening date, which is indicated on the little tag, so a garden center, if they've got one that is about 50 days, and those are about the earliest that you can get. There are some that are maybe 40 days or so, more commonly about 50 days for the very earliest short season tomatoes. So if you can find one of those, that still could probably make it. And those are the number of days from the time you transplant it. So maybe put it in a 5-gallon bucket, give it lots of good care, and I think you'd still see tomatoes.
Is there, that's one of the, because we were talking about that tomatoes are so popular, even people who don't have gardens, but because they can be container plants, so you can grow them in containers. Is there a difference in the kinds of containers? I mean, obviously you want something that can have some fairly deep roots, but you see people also growing them out of coffee cans.
Yeah, you do. And of course, the size of the container is kind of the limiting factor. The size of the container should be at least the size of a 5-gallon pail so that they've got enough root system. And of course, a 5-gallon bucket actually works pretty well. You just drill some holes in the bottom, and that gives you enough volume for that. And it should be a good, high-quality potting mix. And watch the watering because you know how it is in the heat of summer with container plants, so make sure it has good, adequate water.
What are the differences? One term that people should really keep an eye on is determinate and indeterminate tomatoes.
That is the growth habit of a tomato, and tomatoes can be divided into those two classes, which is pretty important. And it will say that on the tag. So determinate tomatoes are more like the bush type habit. The bush type habit, for a determined habit, they kind of set their plant. They kind of grow their plant and then set the fruit and ripen those fruit in kind of a more consolidated habit. So determinate tomato varieties are what was usually recommended for our area because it gives you a good, solid fruit set for canning and plenty of good ones for slicing. You'll still have plenty of tomatoes in September and up towards frost, but you tend to get that more consolidated harvest and not such a huge plant. Indeterminate varieties, the way I remember these terms is indeterminate varieties keep growing, keep producing vines. They grow indiscriminately. Indeterminate, indiscriminately growth. And those are the type that oftentimes would benefit from a cage or staking. Otherwise, they tend to creep over your entire garden. And so indeterminate are very useful for our area too, but they tend to keep growing all the way into fall. And so you at a certain point in the late summer almost should trim some of those back, the growing points, and let them consolidate their fruit. So both work well, indeterminate or determinate. For a pot or a container, always choose the determinate type so you don't get such a very huge, big, massive vine.
Because you talked about tomato cages or staking, is there one preferable should you use one in one situation and another in another situation? And also, when should you start doing that?
Should start. That's the easier question. When should you start? And that's when the plants are still small, would be the preferred. Sometimes when they start rambling, such as even this time of year, it can be difficult to get them inside a cage. So at this time of year, if you suspect, oh shoot, my tomato plants are getting kind of big, I should have done something, then use wooden stakes and some twine or string and support those on wooden stakes. That would be easier at this point. But earlier in the season, tomato cages, and the sturdier, the better. I think we've all probably experienced wimpy tomato cages made of light metal wire, and they just kind of fall apart. Sometimes at the end of the season with that type of cage, I can't get the tomato plant out of the cage, and I've just thrown the whole mess away. Oh. And so a good sturdy cage is the key. But staking, our community gardens, growing together community gardens, use wood stakes and then stake the plants and tie the plants to that stake as they grow.
How far, is one stake enough for a plant? Because some of these tomato plants can be pretty big, and they can be pretty massive. And they can get, as they spread, they can get pretty tippy.
They do. So our sun sugar tomato plant, which gets quite massive with lots and lots of fruit, I use 3 stakes wood stakes in a triangle, and then kind of fashion twine to support that. In the growing together community gardens, they use 1 wood stake, and then they train the stem and tie that main stem of the tomato to that stake as it's growing. So there are different ways it can be done.
You talked about the sun sugar again, and we were talking about sun sugar and grapes. Are all small tomatoes, are they always sweet? Are they sweeter?
Not necessarily. In fact, some of the earlier cherry tomatoes were kind of almost a little sour and bitter. Luckily, most of those have gone by the wayside. But yeah, the cherry tomatoes have come a long way in getting that sweetness to them.
All right, we're going to take a quick little break. And when we come back, we're going to be talking more about tomato care, tomato growth, and just making sure you have a good tomato harvest.
And we can talk about one of my number 1 questions that come in, and that is dealing with tomatoes.
Yes.
Get 3 months of local news for just 99 cents a month. You'll get unlimited access to the news you need to stay engaged and connected to your community. Visit inforum.com/subscribe now to get 3 months of local news for only 99 cents a month.
All right, we're back, and we're talking tomatoes this week. And tomatoes, as we've talked about, the most popular thing for people to grow. And there's really been a lot of research done locally about tomatoes too, right?
There has been. North Dakota State University for many, many years had a tomato breeding program, came up with varieties such as Cheyenne. Cheyenne is still grown. Many people love the variety called Cheyenne, developed at NDSU by tomato breeder Neil Holland. And of course, Neil Holland, who passed away a few years ago at, I believe, about the age 90, 89 or 90. And he was well known across North Dakota, Minnesota, Manitoba, South Dakota, because he was a horticulturist in this area for so many, many years and so well liked. And I got to tell you a little story about tomato breeder Neil Holland, who introduced Cheyenne and Cannonball and others. Lark was another early one. And so each year he would plant out all these with his student helper and technician, plant out all these many, many hundreds of tomato plants. Then they'd pick them and harvest them and analyze them. And Neil Holland once told me, he said, I don't really like tomatoes. I don't really like the taste of tomatoes, which may sound funny for a tomato breeder, but there might have been an advantage to that, because then he didn't have just his personal preference for taste. Instead, he used panels of taste testers. So he didn't have to rely on his own taste, because he said he didn't really like the taste of tomatoes. So that's probably why he was a successful breeder. He brought others into that.
I love that.
That's kind of a fun story.
You were talking about a couple of different tomato varieties, and you said that you're only growing 4 different kinds, and it didn't sound like any. But last year we picked up some kind of heritage tomato plants. There's a couple of tomato plants that they're black, aren't they? The fruits will actually they'll be very, very dark. What do those have? I think like some of those they describe the taste is kind of almost like tobacco-y or something like that, but they odd thing.
You bring
smoky.
up the good point about heirloom tomatoes.
Yeah.
And heirloom tomatoes are a great trend. There are all these heritage-type tomatoes, some brought from Europe that have been maintained for many, many years. Some of them are almost black in color or very dark purple. And, that also brings up the good point about, okay, what are we looking for in a tomato? Yeah, we want it to grow well. We want it to, okay. But most of us are looking for flavor. We want it to, it's got to taste good. Otherwise, it'll taste like a store-bought tomato.
Right.
And so we're looking for flavor. And there are many of these heirloom-type tomatoes that people like a specific flavor. And I mean, that's going to be personal preference on these. And so there are many of the heirloom-type old varieties that people are looking for that certain flavor that they feel some of those have. A downside to the heirloom-type tomatoes is they don't have a lot of disease resistance bred in. The modern cultivars have usually been developed to have blight resistance and be more disease resistant, so they have advantages there too. But some of what you grow is a lot of personal preferences to which varieties you like to choose. But yeah, it's interesting. When you open seed catalogs, you'll see a lot of these different types of varieties, including some that are very, very large, different colors. Some of the names are interesting. There's an old one called Mortgage Lifter.
I've heard of that.
Yeah,
yes,
which was an heirloom. Farmers market people could grow that to pay off their mortgage, I guess. And there are varieties like Oxheart, and some of the names are quite unique too on those.
How often should I be fertilizing my tomatoes?
Very important during the first part of the growing season. So you're getting a good, solid plant with lots of potential for bloom. And then when they're blooming and the fruits are enlarging, that's important to be fertilizing too. You could give an early season fertilizing, such as when you plant them in May and then in June and about this time of year. And then that should really carry it on through. So fertilizing kind of as the fruit are developing. So there are special tomato fertilizers. You can buy those. You could use just an all-purpose, well-balanced 10-10-10 fertilizer. The water-soluble Miracle Grow is probably the most commonly available one of that. You could do that. And so giving it the good nutrition and in the month of July, we talked about in previous podcasts about stopping fertilizing on trees, shrubs, perennials. But tomatoes, as they're developing with a water-soluble type, you could continue fertilizing here into July as well.
Because they are an annual.
They are.
So we treat them kind of like
you would your pots of petunias and other things that are continuing to grow.
How about, because we've talked about like the need for having structure, having either a cage or staking tomatoes, because they can get, like I said, really tippy. They can get kind of unwieldy. Should we be pruning tomato plants? And if so, how should we do that? How should we trim them back?
So if you do any investigating on tomato growth, you'll oftentimes run into tomato pruning. And tomato pruning is used on the indeterminate types. Remember I said they grow indiscriminately? So that you don't get such a big, huge, massive vine, tomato pruning can help. So when you do a little bit of searching on how to prune a tomato on these types, they will usually recommend that you just have one or at least two main stems. That's the main stalk that comes up out of the tomato. When the tomato starts growing, it has that one stalk. As the tomato begins to grow, starts to grow, it will develop side shoots on those indeterminate types. And so you'll see those side shoots kind of in the axils of the leaf, where the leaf meets the main stem, you'll see these little called sucker sprouts. And so in pruning tomatoes, you remove those so that you just have one or at most two main stalks. Now you have to watch, though, in the axils of the leaf, where the leaf joins the stem. That's also where the flower buds will form. So you don't want to prune those off, but these little vegetative shoots that you'll see growing, kind of like a new little stem forming, that is what you prune off. You can just prune them off by pinching or nip them off with the pruning shears. And so as they're forming, that's what you remove, that's what you prune off. That will allow the plant's energy to go into fruit production. You won't get such a massive amount of vines and stems. You'll get a more consolidated fruit set, and each tomato will be larger, and it won't have such a big tangle of vines.
And that also helps, too, when it comes time to harvest them. You don't have to be pulling away all this mass. You don't have to go into the jungle, right, of a tomato plant.
To find the tomato, and you don't have to hunt underneath to see if you got a ripe tomato under there. Now, what if you don't prune those? They'll still grow fine. I don't always get my tomatoes pruned as much as I should, and they still do fine. But like you said, John, and you don't have to try to weed through the tangle, the jungle to find the tomatoes.
No, we've talked about blossom end rot is a problem that a lot of people have. Mulching, you said, is a good solution for that. How much mulch should you be putting down around the?
You just mentioned my number one garden question, other than autumn blaze maples and what's going on with autumn blaze maples. But next to that, maybe close tie, is blossom end rot on tomatoes. Okay, blossom end rot is a disorder. It's not caused by a disease, a bacteria, fungus, or anything like that. It's a disorder that results in a blackened bottom on the fruit, the developing fruit. It can be kind of blackish, brownish, sunken, kind of leathery. And on the top side, where it attaches to the plant, you might think, oh, gosh, I got a nice tomato that's ripening up. Then you look at the underside, and it's all black and sunken, called blossom end rot. So what happens with that is the plant is not able to get enough calcium. And so the plant sucks the calcium out of the developing fruit, leaving that blackened end. So our first reaction might be, well, just add more calcium. But our soils already have lots of calcium in it. But the calcium isn't available in a form that the plant can take up. And so if you add more calcium, it can actually damage the plant from excess. Sometimes you'll see people add Tums in the bottom, because, Tums is a calcium thing. Add Tums to the planting hole, but that doesn't work because, again, our soil has plenty of calcium. Okay, so what's the problem? The problem is the calcium isn't in a form the plant can use. And to be in that form, it needs to be in a solution, a water solution, to dissolve that soil calcium so the plant's roots can drink it on up. So the key is to keep the soil more uniformly moist, which will keep the soil calcium in a solution that the plant roots can drink on up. So you mentioned mulch. One of the best ways to keep the soil moisture more uniform is by putting mulch on top of the soil surface around the tomato plant. That will keep that moisture more uniformly consistent and stop these highs and lows of moisture. So how thick should you go? Probably a couple inches, at least 2 inches thick. Dried grass clippings that have not been treated with herbicide work very well. Straw that is clean and not herbicide treated. Shredded bark will work well too. And all of those materials at the end of the season can be tilled into the soil surface as well. So mulching is the key, or keeping it sprinkled, moisten only the soil. That helps prevent leaf diseases if you just keep the water on the soil and not up on the leaf.
So not overhead watering with a water can with the spray, that simulates a rain, right?
Exactly. That can spread more foliage diseases. Of course, rain comes from above naturally, so some of that is natural. But if, in addition to the rains, if we're watering by overhead, then we're giving it a lot more water on the leaves, which then can promote more leaf diseases. So watering just the soil.
Okay. And so when we talk about planting tomato plants, one of the things that's unique about tomato plants is you can plant them really pretty deep, and that will actually be you planting them a little bit deeper helps give that support so that when they grow, they have that foundation. They're sturdy in the soil. When we're mulching, do we, sometimes with mulching like around trees, we don't want that mulch to reach the base of the tree. We want to keep it a little bit further
so
away.
The trunk doesn't rot.
Right.
Yep,
So
exactly.
do we want that same thing, or with tomatoes, can we go flush with the stem?
You can go flush with the stem. Yep, because the mulch isn't going to be around there as long as a tree in which that mulch is going to be around there for years and years. So it can go right up to the stem of the tomato, or maybe just a hair away. But you bring up the good point about planting deeply. When you do that in May, plant them good and deep, because then the tomato stem will produce all these roots. And also that gets the root system down into soil that's more apt to stay moist. And so deep planting can help eliminate blossom end rot also.
And we talked about, how you don't want the leaves to necessarily get wet. Should you, as you add more mulch, should you remove those lower branches that the leaves may be touching the mulch then?
That's a good point. One way to keep leaf diseases from progressing up on a tomato plant is to simply remove the lower leaves that might be touching the soil, because these disease-causing organisms will be spread from the soil by splashing water. And by removing the lower leaves, you can even do that proactively, or for sure, when you start seeing a little bit of yellowing or spotting on the leaves, then remove those lower leaves. The plant can easily do without them.
So once you spot blossom end rot, is it too late? Is the plant a goner? Or can you take these measures like adding mulch and trimming up the bottom leaves and making sure you're only watering the base? Will that help save the plant, or is the plant a goner?
The good news is the plant is not a goner. Even if the tomato fruits have blossom end rot, you just pick those tomatoes off, toss them away, or if part of it is still good, there's nothing wrong with eating that, but sometimes they're not very palatable, I guess. So anyway, the fruit itself is fine, and oftentimes it's the first tomatoes that are affected, and the plant will work its way out of that problem, and the later tomatoes are usually okay. But it's those first tomatoes that we really prize. That first tomato, you're
so exciting,
so hungry for it. And so sometimes you'll see the tales about, since it's lack of calcium or inability to calcium, what if we just add eggshells? Or I've even heard of people putting milk on the plant, to give it calcium. But again, those are not forms that the plant can take up. We got enough calcium, so we'll just keep it moist, and then it'll be in solution the plant can take up.
Now, we've talked about how we don't want to water from above. I've seen different kind of contraptions or devices where you could put essentially like a bottle of a wine bottle, fill it with water, and then you put it in a sleeve
Sure.
that goes into the ground. Is that a helpful way of doing it too?
Yeah, that will work. Soaker hoses laid along the base of plants, those work well as well.
Anything else with tomato plants that we should be talking about? Because there's so much. Is there anything that I've missed?
I think there is one thing that I believe we haven't talked about, and that's the importance of the variety, choosing a good variety. And there are so many, but I've kind of limited it down to a few that I really like. And once you hit a variety that you like, then it's fun to keep doing that one. Maybe add a few more into your garden and see if you like those too. But it's so important to watch the cultivar from the very beginning when you're choosing it. The main thing that they vary in addition to disease and flavor and all that, is the length of time to ripening. And if a person chooses wrongly, you could choose a tomato that's not going to ripen into September. And if a tomato has a ripening time of 85 to 90 or 100 days, that's going to be a very late tomato. So sometimes I'm asked, gosh, my tomatoes just didn't ripen until way into September. What did I do wrong? They maybe haven't done anything wrong, but the original selection of their cultivar might have been one that just ripens really, really late. So that's why it's so important from the onset to choose a variety, a cultivar well adapted to our area. And for main season, that's about 65 to 78 day is to choose cultivars with those days to maturity. Otherwise, gosh, it is fun. Homegrown tomatoes are absolutely awesome.
So what do you do with your tomatoes?
Well, we eat lots of them fresh. We make salsa. And my mom used to make ketchup. But as I remember, it took a whole lot of tomatoes and a whole lot of time to boil that down into ketchup. So we don't do ketchup. We eat them fresh and make salsa. Oh, we also do take some of them and just freeze them whole. Mary cans them too.
Okay.
But if there's more than what you can at a time, we freeze them whole, take out the stem end and just freeze them whole in freezer bags, put them in the freezer. And then they work really well in the middle of winter for chili.
Okay.
Yeah, so it's fun. Our daughter turned us on to that.
What's
an easy way to keep the tomatoes.
What's your favorite type of tomato, like as a slicer, so to put on a sandwich, or we make a lot of BLTs. What's your favorite tomato for that?
Big beef.
Big beef.
Yep.
Okay.
They're a good meaty tomato. They've got good size. If you slice one of those, it'll usually cover a sandwich just fine.
It delivers its name.
It does. And yet it's not one of the late ripening tomatoes. Some of the beefsteak types are so late, but big beef gives you a nice big size within our growing season.
And you talked about celebrity. What do you use your celebrity on?
And celebrity is a great one for canning and salsa. And both Big Beef and Celebrity were All-America winners, so they've been tried and true varieties. They have good disease resistance, and so I kind of like to think about those as kind of foolproof, but better than that, they've got good flavor. And it's interesting. Now, within the last 2 years, they've come up with Big Beef Plus and Celebrity Plus. They've got a little more disease resistance, and they've bred even a little deeper color into them. Now, when I say bred, that's an interesting comment. Now, heirloom tomatoes are not hybrids. They're called open-pollinated. Many of the modern cultivars from 1960 onward are hybrids. And now, hybrid isn't a dirty word in plants. If a bee takes pollen from one plant, takes it to another plant, it's created a hybrid. So plant breeders have simply done the work of bees and purposely selected which parents they want to cross to make these hybrids. So hybrid isn't anything kind of weird and sciencey. It can be a very natural thing. So heirloom tomatoes are great. The modern hybrids are great. And so anyway, it's kind of fun to talk about that.
Well, if people have questions for you, or if they want to send you pictures of their tomatoes, or even send in recipes, what's the best way to reach you?
Is my email, donald.kinzler, Kinzler, at ndsu.edu. And photos are good. As long as we're talking about tomatoes, recently I've gotten some photos of tomatoes that have a bit of a problem. And the problem is, on the tomato plants, curling and cupping of leaves in kind of a weird distortion. And in both cases, they've been exposed to herbicide, weed killers. And that can come from like lawn clippings that were used around them that were treated with herbicide, or maybe there was a little drift, or maybe it was contaminated compost or contaminated manure. And so we also need to be on the lookout for not exposing our vegetables to sprays or carryover from sprays from our lawn. That's why it's so important to be so cautious with our weed control.
All right. Well, if you have questions, send them to Don.
Yeah,
otherwise,
it's always great to hear. I really enjoy when our listeners write in and say, gosh, we enjoyed listening to the podcast, and here's what's happening in my garden. I really enjoy, even if you don't have a question, it's just fun to share information. Some of my favorite emails, I love answering questions naturally, but some of my favorites are seeing what other people are growing or having, or maybe they got something unusual, it's fun to share, or maybe they've got a garden tip that has worked for them. And I love hearing from people.
I think, yeah, that's true. That even if you garden in a fenced-in backyard like we have, we still want to share that with people. And I think that's what one of the things that makes gardening such a fun thing is that it is really a community thing. Even if you can't see from the street in there, but the people will come out and they'll want to talk about their garden. And a lot of times they'll say, "Why don't you come back? I'll show you."
And that's why when we relocated our home 7 years ago, I located all the flower beds, the perennial flowers and annual flowers, all out in the front yard. So that when I'm out working in them in the evening, it's fun. People pass by and we'll talk. We'll talk about, see what they got going. They can see what I got going. And so it's fun.
All right. Well, we will talk again next week.
Have a great week, everybody, and enjoy this summer season.
Growing Together, a gardening podcast, is sponsored by Bloomfield Garden Center, a family-owned retail greenhouse providing locally grown plants since 1974. You can find them 1 mile north of Sabin, Minnesota, or 6 miles south of I-94 at exit 6. Just a quick drive from Fargo-Moorhead.